Det var jo de årene da en hadde nok så sterke indre brytninger. Indre brytninger.
Hei, og velkommen til Noen har snakket sammen. Mitt navn Aksel Fjellavli.
Og jeg heter Siril Rustan Halvorsen.
I dag så skal dere få høre et foredrag, nærmere bestemt et foredrag som ble avholdt i Universitetets aula denne uka her, som Tankesmien Agenda arrangerte sammen med Universitetet i Oslo. Den dere skal få høre David Wengrow. Han arkeolog og skrevet boka The Dawn of Everything.
Det stemmer. Han har skrevet den sammen med David Graeber, antropolog, som mange kanskje har hørt om. Han har skrevet blant annet om bullshit jobs. Og foredraget basert på den boka som nå også kom på norsk. Da heter den Begynnelsen på alt. Så i foredraget så får dere jo høre litt om hvordan menneskehetens historie ikke har gått som en lineær og uproblematisk utvikling fra liksom steinaldermennesket til oss i dag, men via omveier ulikt gjennom både tiden og steder på jorda. Han snakker mye om byenes utvikling, ulikhet i de ulike byene, statsdannelser og så videre. Så hvis jeg skal liksom oppsummere det jeg tror hans hovedpoeng, så det at man kan velge seg hva slags samfunn og liv man vil leve som menneske og som menneskehet. Det ikke sånn at med økonomisk og teknologisk utvikling så følger det også nødvendigvis fattigdom og ulikhet da, og makt og ufrihet. Man kan også velge noe annet, så egentlig en ganske sånn optimistisk budskap da.
Vi får bare ta en lytt.
Yep.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your hospitality. Thank you to all the working people who've made it possible for me to visit here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in this extraordinary space, which really, I think it's quite right what was just said. It's an incredible honor to present the book in these surroundings. Feels sort of right somehow for the topic. Thank you. We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right time for a metamorphosis of the gods, that is, of the fundamental principles and symbols. So wrote Carl Jung in his 1958 book, published in English, with the title The Undiscovered Self. 70 years on, Jung's scientific reputation has not fared too well. But when my late co-author David Graeber and I were seeking an epitaph for our new attempt at a history of humanity, which we called The Dawn of Everything, Jung's words rang true, as does the title of the book, at least in English, to which they belong, The Undiscovered Self. It is our contention in our book that the basic principles around which, for centuries, we've been orienting our understanding of the human past, and so of ourselves, are flawed. Or as David put it once playfully on Twitter, prehistory, everything you know is wrong. The occasion for his tweet was the publication of our first public essay together in 2018. It was in an online journal called Eurozine, an essay with the rather immodest title, How to Change the Course of Human History, at least the part that's already happened. In it, we suggested that because of the accumulation of new information in our fields, the anchor points of human history, those reference points around which we structure our consciousness of human history, of the deep past, have become unstable, perhaps to the point of collapse, and that something like a new science of human history will now need to be built. Of course, we don't claim to have done that ourselves, which would be a ridiculously arrogant claim for anybody to make. But we do make the case for starting with a synthesis between the disciplines we trained in. Me, an archaeologist, and David, an anthropologist. Archaeology being the direct study of the human past from its material remains, and anthropology the comparative study of human societies and cultures. Once upon a time, these used to be closely related fields. Today they've drifted apart. We wanted to see what happens when you put them back together again after a period of mutual estrangement. And the results astonished us, because it quickly became apparent that when you start doing this, a whole new picture of our species, its past, and its future possibilities starts to come into view. Let's very briefly rehearse the conventional picture of the broad sweep of human history, which has been around for a very long time. In fact, it was created mainly by philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, long before there was any direct evidence of what social life was like in the remote past. Here's roughly how it goes. Once upon a time, so the story goes, we were hunter-gatherers, living in a prolonged state of childlike innocence, in tiny bands. These bands were egalitarian. They could be, for the very reason that they were so small. It was only after the agricultural revolution, and then still more the rise of cities, that this happy condition came to an end, ushering in civilization and the state, which also meant the appearance of written literature, science, and philosophy. But at the same time, almost everything bad in human life. Patriarchy, standing armies, mass executions, and annoying bureaucrats demanding that we spend much of our lives filling in forms. Now, of course, that's a really crude simplification, but it really does seem to be the foundational story that rises to the surface whenever anyone, from, say, an industrial psychologist to a revolutionary theorist, says something like, but of course, human beings spent most of their evolutionary history living in groups of 20 people. Or agriculture was perhaps humanity's worst mistake. Many popular writers of so-called big history books today make these points quite explicitly. The only real alternative to this rather depressing view of human history, or at least the only one on offer until now, is even more grim. It says that human societies began not in a state of innocence and equality, but in a state of brutal competition. And that the only way we could progress, especially when populations began to grow was by taming those base instincts and embracing the existence of governments, courts, bureaucracies, police, and so on. In this view, which owes far more to Thomas Hobbes than to Rousseau, self-interest and the drive to accumulate power have always been at the root of human social behavior. It's just that collectively we've learned it's to our advantage to prioritize long-term interests over short-term instincts, or create laws that force us to keep our dog-eat-dog impulses under control, or confine them to useful areas like the economy. As you'll gather, both ways of understanding the course of human history rest on profound assumptions. Assumptions about human nature. Are we innately good and cooperative, or selfish and competitive? And although they appear to begin from opposite ends of the spectrum, both ways of understanding our past have rather similar implications. What they tell us, in essence, is that living in small societies meant a state of freedom and simplicity, whether that was simply awful and chaotic or simply wonderful, depends who you believe. While living in big societies means complexity and sophistication, but always at a price. The price of steep inequalities in human welfare and the loss of those original freedoms. With 8 billion people on the planet today, we're left to draw the obvious and dismal conclusion, which is that any real prospect of restructuring society so as to eliminate altogether the most ruthless forms of structural inequality, homelessness, poverty, slavery, racism, sexism, has long ago been taken off the table. The effect of telling such stories again and again is to make wistful pessimism about the human condition seem like common sense. Yes, living in a truly egalitarian society might be possible if you're a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, but if you want to create a society of true equality today, you're going to have to figure out a way to go back to becoming tiny bands of foragers again, with no significant personal property. And since foragers require pretty extensive territory to forage in, that would mean reducing the world's population by about 99.9%. Otherwise, the best we can hope for is to adjust the size of the boot, to paraphrase George Orwell, the size of the boot that will be stomping on our faces forever. Fortunately, there is a problem with these familiar notions of human history and civilization. They're not true. Over the last few decades, information has been pouring in from all quarters of the globe, which throws almost every aspect of these familiar stories into disarray. Still, as we found, the most remarkable discoveries remain confined to the work of specialists, or have to be teased out by reading between the lines of scientific publications. And even the specialists are not always communicating with each other very well about their findings. So my role, as I see it today, is much easier than whoever is looking after our friend. Good luck. Our role, as I see it today, is to try and give a little sense of how different the emerging picture of human history really is, for those who don't have the time or the inclination or the institutional advantages to break through paywalls into the hallowed halls of academic publishing. Let's begin with cities. It used to be thought that on all the world's continents, the first cities emerged together, with systems of centralized government and top-down control. Think of ancient Egypt, thank you, with its pyramid temples, or Shang China with its lavish royal tombs. The classic Maya, with their warlike rulers and deadly ball games, or the Inca Empire, with its mountain palaces and mummified kings and queens. But we know today that this is not the case. For example, cities already existed on the lower reaches of the Yellow River more than 1,000 years before China's first known royal dynasty. And on the other side of the Pacific, along Peru's Rio Supe, cities appear more than 4 millennia before the Inca Empire. We can say very little as yet about how those cities functioned, but their existence is beyond doubt. In other cases, we can say more. In ancient Mesopotamia, the modern countries of Iraq and Syria, archaeology provides evidence for roughly 1,000 years of urban life before the appearance of kingship and warring states. And even after those appeared, it is abundantly clear that key decision-making powers in cities were vested in urban councils and popular assemblies. Around 4,500 years ago, cities arose in the Indus Valley at places like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the modern country of Pakistan. But they have left us no clear trace of kings or queens, no grand monuments or royal tombs. Much of the population of these first South Asian cities lived in high-quality housing. Even earlier, in what is now Ukraine, archaeologists have revealed extensive remains of cities dating back some 6,000 years. Traces of these gigantic sites lurk less than a meter below the rich, dark soils of the Ukrainian steppe, locally called Chernozem, black soils, to the north of the Black Sea, in the vicinity of the modern city of Uman. They are as ancient and as large as the first Mesopotamian cities, or for comparison, that's roughly equivalent to the size of medieval London. But at no point in their long history did these Ukrainian cities present evidence for authoritarian rulers. In fact, they present no trace of central government or social stratification at all. No palaces, no temples, no central stockpiles of wealth, nor any indication of bureaucratic control. Instead, what we find are some thousands of equally sized domestic buildings, carefully organized into a system of neighborhoods, each provided with an assembly hall, a strikingly egalitarian pattern of urban life which lasted for almost 1,000 years. It seems increasingly clear that long before what we think of as the birth of democracy in ancient Greece, there were already well-organized cities on most of the world's continents that present no evidence whatsoever for ruling dynasties, and sometimes seem to have done all right without mandarins, priests, and warrior politicians too. Of course, not all early cities were like this, and none of the cities that I've been describing was perfectly egalitarian. Many left no urban legacy behind them to continue into the present. Some, indeed, went on to become the centers of kingdoms and empires. But it's important to note that others did the opposite. To take one well-documented example, around the year 200 AD, the city of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, with a population of at least 100,000 people, underwent a profound transformation, turning its back on pyramid temples and human sacrifices, and reconstructing itself as a vast collection of comfortable villas with subfloor drainage and spacious living quarters, housing most of the city's population. When archaeologists first encountered these grand apartment buildings, they assumed they must be palaces, until they realized then that almost everyone in the city was living in a palace. Again, none of this is to claim that any of these societies was perfectly peaceful or egalitarian. But to keep things in perspective, let's just remember that 5th century Athens, which we look to as the birthplace of democracy, was itself a militaristic society founded on chattel slavery and the systematic repression of women. At this point, one might raise a reasonable objection. If cities without rulers or deep structural inequalities were really so common in human history, then surely Europeans would have encountered at least some cities like this when they began their conquest of the Americas. In the 16th century, Mexico, or what is now called Mexico, was one such land, teeming with indigenous cities, dominated by the spectacular Aztec capital at Tenochtitlan. So why did Cortés and the other conquistadors find only kingdoms and empires? Except this is not the case either. In 1519, Hernán Cortés reported back to the King of Spain that on approaching the Valley of Mexico, he had found a city where the order of governance resembles very much the republics of Venice, Genoa, or Pisa. For there is, he wrote, no supreme overlord. Its name was Tlaxcala. As it turns out, the city of Tlaxcala was run by an elected council, which reached decisions through debate and consensus at a time when such things were almost unheard of in Europe. Our knowledge of the workings of this indigenous urban parliament is very far from complete, but we do know some very telling facts about how individuals were selected for office. Far from being asked to demonstrate personal charisma or the ability to outdo their rivals, those who aspired to a role on the Council of Tlaxcala had to do so in a spirit of self-deprecation. They were required to subordinate themselves to the people of the city. And to ensure this was just no mere show, each would-be politician was subject to trials, starting with mandatory exposure to public abuse, and then with your ego shredded in tatters, a long period of seclusion when the incumbent politician suffered ordeals of fasting, sleep deprivation, bloodletting, and a strict regime of moral instruction. Even after that, politicians might be periodically whipped by their constituents to remind them who was ultimately in charge. Clearly, taking up office in this indigenous democracy required personality traits a little different from those we take for granted in modern electoral politics. In fact, it was precisely at Tlaxcala that Cortés found military allies who enabled him to launch his successful attack, eventually, on the Aztec capital at Tenochtitlan, a turning point in the global rise of Western imperialism, an event that we usually think of as a triumph of guns, germs, and steel, forgetting that it was also, at least partly, the outcome of deliberations in an indigenous parliament. Archaeologists have worked to uncover the pre-conquest city of Tlaxcala and found that here too, the most imposing structures were not palaces or pyramid temples, but the well-appointed residences of ordinary citizens constructed around district plazas to uniformly high standards. And it's not just our understanding of cities that archaeology is turning on its head. We also know now that the history of human social life before the coming of cities, even before the invention of farming, is simply nothing like what we once imagined. Far from living most of their lives in small bands of hunter-gatherers, we now have evidence for a truly wild variety of social and political experimentation before the appearance of agriculture. To give you just a flavor of this diversity, let me mention briefly a few examples brought to light by archaeological science over the last few decades. In sub-Saharan Africa, we can now show that hunter-gatherers some 50,000 years ago maintained social networks of impressive scale, spanning the southern and eastern parts of the continent. And in Europe, during the last ice age, around 25,000 years ago, we find evidence all the way across the continent, from Russia to the Mediterranean, that certain individuals were being singled out for grand burials, their bodies covered with elaborate costumes, weaponry, and regalia. Archaeologists have playfully called these Ice Age burials princes and princesses, without always stopping to ask why we find so little evidence for their kingdoms or principalities, just the burials themselves. I'll come back to this point in a moment. In Central and Eastern Europe, then covered by steppe and tundra, we also find the remains of enormous and elaborate public buildings constructed from the bones and tusks of woolly mammoth, standing out clearly from ordinary dwellings. Even more strikingly, in the Middle East, around 11,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers built enormous stone temples at places such as Göbekli Tepe in eastern Turkey, centuries before the domestication of wheat and barley. In Japan, we know that the storehouses of Sane Maruyama could already hold massive surpluses of wild plant foods long before the arrival of rice farming from the Korean peninsula, and before the coming of maize cultivation to North America. Indigenous peoples were already constructing massive earthworks like those of Poverty Point in what's now Louisiana, creating amphitheaters that were large enough to host hunter-gatherer publics in their thousands. Remove the blinkers, and you can see before you evidence for a pre-agricultural world that is simply nothing like what we once imagined. This was not a world of roving hunter-gatherer bands, although no doubt these existed too, but one of sedentary towns and villages, monumental sanctuaries, and stockpiled wealth. Quite often, it seems, hunter-gatherer societies alternated routinely between hierarchical and egalitarian arrangements, switching around their group size and political structures with the changing requirements of the seasons, taking on radically different forms in times of abundance and of scarcity. This is important for a variety of reasons, not least because it implies that far from living in a state of primitive innocence and naivety, early human populations would already have been conscious of multiple social possibilities and multiple ways of arranging their affairs. Now, radically changing your social identity, your economic habits, or your political systems with the changing seasons might sound quite appealing. But it's something difficult for most of us to imagine these days, maybe even in the Nordic countries. How such arrangements might have worked in practice can be illuminated, however, by the much more recent history of populations like the circumpolar Inuit, the Nambiquara of the Amazon rainforest, or the First Nations of the American Great Plains. Anthropologists over a century ago used to describe societies of this sort as possessing a double morphology. Marcel Mauss, writing in the early 20th century, observed that the circumpolar Inuit, and likewise many other societies, have two social structures, one in summer, one in winter, and that in parallel they have two systems of law and religion. In the summer months, Inuit dispersed into small patriarchal bands in pursuit of freshwater fish, caribou, and reindeer, each under the authority of a single male elder. Property was possessively marked, and patriarchs exercised coercive, sometimes even tyrannical power over their families. But in the long winter months, when seals and walrus flocked to the Arctic shore, another social structure entirely took over as Inuit gathered together to build great meeting houses of wood, whale ribs, and stone. Within them, the virtues of equality, altruism, and collective life prevailed. Wealth was shared. Husbands and wives exchanged partners under the aegis of Sedna, the goddess of the sea. Another example were the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Canada's northwest coast, for whom winter, not summer, was the time when society crystallized into its most unequal form, spectacularly so. Plank-built palaces sprang to life along the coastlines of British Columbia, with hereditary nobles holding court over commoners and slaves, and hosting the great banquets known as potlatch. Yet these aristocratic courts broke apart for the summer work of the fishing season, reverting to smaller clan formations, still ranked, but with an entirely different and less formal structure. In this case, people actually adopted different names in the summer and the winter, literally becoming another person, depending on the time of year. Perhaps most striking in terms of political reversals were the seasonal practices of 19th century tribal confederacies on the American Great Plains, one-time farmers who had adopted a nomadic hunting life. In the late summer, small and highly mobile bands of Cheyenne and Lakota would congregate in large settlements to make logistical preparations for the annual bison hunt, the buffalo. At this most sensitive time of year, they appointed a police force, which exercised full coercive powers, including the right to imprison, whip, or fine any offender who endangered the proceedings. Yet, as the anthropologist Robert Lowy observed, this unequivocal authoritarianism operated on a strictly seasonal and temporary basis, giving way to more anarchic forms of organization once the hunting season and the Sundance rituals which came after it were finished. And membership of these police systems also rotated annually. So if you're on the giving end of harsh justice one year, you may be on the receiving end the next. Interesting implications for policing. Quite independently, archaeological evidence suggests that in the highly seasonal environments of the last ice age, our remote ancestors were behaving in broadly similar ways, shifting back and forth between alternative social arrangements, permitting the rise of authoritarian structures during certain times of year on the proviso that they could not last. With such institutional flexibility comes the capacity to step outside the boundaries of any given social structure and reflect, to both make and unmake the political worlds we live in. If nothing else, this explains those strange princes and princesses of the last ice age who appear to show up in such magnificent isolation, like characters in some fairy tale or costume drama. Did the invention of agriculture really mean the onset of inequality, or the inception of private property, a departure from some egalitarian Eden? At the very least, I suggest, such findings place these questions in a dramatically different light. In truth, this should come as no surprise. Consider, for example, briefly the case of the Calusa. One of the first North American societies described by European explorers in the 16th century, the Calusa were a non-agricultural people, hunters, fishers, and gatherers, who inhabited the west coast of Florida, from Tampa Bay down to the Keys. There they had established a small kingdom, ruled from a capital town called Kalos, which today is marked by a 30-hectare complex of high shell mounds and middens known as Mound Key. Fish, shellfish, and large marine animals comprised a major part of the Calusa diet, with also deer, raccoon, and a whole variety of birds. Calusa also maintained a fleet of war canoes, with which they would launch military raids on nearby populations, extracting processed foods, skins, weapons, amber, metals, and slaves as tribute. When Juan Ponce de Leon entered Charlotte Harbor on the 4th of June, 1513, he was met by a well-organized flotilla of such canoes, manned by heavily armed hunter-gatherers. Some historians resist calling the Calusa leader, the king. They prefer terms like paramount chief. But first-hand accounts leave no doubt about his exalted status. At the time of initial European contact, the man known as Carlos, ruler of Kalos, even looked like a European king. He wore a gold diadem and beaded leg bands and sat on a wooden throne. Crucially, he was the only Calusa who was allowed to do this. Now, confronted with such cases, those who believe in the idea that agriculture was a necessary foundation for durable inequalities have two options: ignore them, or claim that they represent some kind of anomaly. Surely they will say, foragers, hunters and gatherers who do these kinds of things, raiding their neighbors, stockpiling wealth, creating elaborate court ceremonial, defending their territories, aren't really foragers at all, or at least not true foragers. Surely they must be farmers by other means, or maybe practicing agriculture just with wild crops, or maybe somehow caught in a moment of transition on the way to becoming farmers, just not quite arrived. All of these are excellent examples of what the British philosopher Anthony Flew called the no true Scotsman style of argument, also known to logicians as the ad hoc rescue procedure. For those not familiar with it, it works like this. Imagine Hamish MacDonald, a Scotsman, sitting down with his Glasgow Morning Herald and seeing an article about how the Brighton sex maniac strikes again. Hamish is shocked and declares that no Scotsman would do such a thing. The next day, he sits down to read his Glasgow Morning Herald again, and this time finds an article about a man from Aberdeen whose brutal actions make the Brighton sex maniac seem almost gentlemanly. This fact shows that Hamish was wrong in his opinion, but is he going to admit this? Not likely. This time he says, no true Scotsman would do such a thing. Philosophers frown on this style of argumentation as a classic informal fallacy or circular logic. You just assert a proposition, hunter-gatherers do not have aristocracies, and then you protect it from any possible counterexamples by continually moving the goalposts. But even if we try to unsee all the accumulated evidence to the contrary, it would still be very difficult to keep propping up the idea of an agricultural revolution and writing off people like the Calusa as evolutionary quirks or anomalies, because there is another reason why we can't really talk anymore of an agricultural revolution, which is simply that in most parts of the world, whether China or the Middle East or Mesoamerica, detailed studies of plant and animal remains from some hundreds of archaeological sites now tell us something else, which is that the transition from living on wild resources to a life based on food production was typically very slow. It took something in the order of 3,000 years. It's a long time for a revolution. And in some cases, like the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the societies that resulted actually look strikingly egalitarian, these early agricultural societies, when compared with their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Okay, I think it's time to bring a few of these threads together and take stock. In the broad sweep of human history, there is, I suggest, no longer any particular reason to believe that societies which are small in scale are especially likely to be egalitarian, or that large ones must necessarily have kings, presidents, and top-down structures of administration. These turn out to be just so many prejudices, dressed up as facts or even as laws of history. As the historical verdict comes in, we begin to see that egalitarian cities, even regional confederacies, are historically not so unusual, while egalitarian families and egalitarian households are decidedly unusual. This fact alone has some far-reaching implications. For instance, almost everyone today insists that participatory democracy can work in a small community or an activist group, but couldn't possibly scale up to anything like a city or a region or a nation. But the evidence before our eyes, if we choose to look at it, suggests the opposite. Today, our scientific means of understanding the past, both of our species and of our planet, is advancing with dizzying speed. Scientists in 2022 may not quite be encountering alien civilizations in distant star systems, but we are encountering radically different forms of society under our feet, forgotten ways of being human and living together in large numbers. We know now that there was no single original form of human society, and no single trajectory that leads from our origins to the kind of radically unequal societies we now take for granted. Instead, what archaeology and anthropology show us is a multiplicity of paths not taken. This seems all the more important because, as a species, we do now appear to be heading into what the ancient Greeks called kairos, a window of time when our very capacity for change is put to the test. If we fail, it is not because of history or evolution. Our remote ancestors were not the drab stick figures of social evolutionary theory or philosophical speculation. Instead, we turn out to be a strikingly playful, inventive species, but a species that now appears to be stuck in a deadly game of extraction and expansion. Growth, 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 as the Tory party back home likes to put it. And as we head collectively into the harshest of seasons with apparently no way out. Maybe what's become clear in the larger scheme of things is that the biggest question facing us now is not how do we get back to equality, but rather have we, Homo sapiens, supposedly the cleverest of apes, have we really forgotten how to change the rules of the game? Thank you very much.
Ja, da skal vi anbefale noe helt til slutt også, Aksel. mange skal kanskje til Stavanger og Coconomics til uka, den økonomifestivalen som der. Dit kommer blant annet også Oliver Bullough. Men for dere som ikke skal til Stavanger, så kommer også Oliver Bullough til Oslo for å lansere den nye boka si som forlaget Respublika har oversatt. Den heter Bøttel for verden, og skal lanseres torsdag 27. oktober klokken 19:30 på Kulturhuset i Oslo. Den boka handler i stor grad om hvordan Storbritannia sitt finanssentrum, City, og lover og regler i Storbritannia har i stor grad lagt til rette for hvitvasking, gjemming unna penger, russiske oligarker med mer. Så det jo en finanstriller. Så det både en bok og en lansering å anbefale.
Det høres veldig bra ut, og for de som interessert i mer etter de har sjekket ut det, så hadde vi også Oliver Bullough i podcasten for et par år siden. Begynte vel å bli det. Han snakket om sin forrige bok da, som heter Pengeland, som sikkert noen av dere også har lest.
Ja. Hadde du en anbefaling, eller var det den?
Jo, for så vidt. I det litt mer tøysete hjørnet. Hva skal jeg si? Det jo mye å si om britiske tabloider. Noe av det helt jævlig, og grunn til å være kritisk til. De burde hatt et BFU. Men de kan jo også tabloidkunst i Storbritannia. Så jeg tenkte å anbefale en greie som Daily Star har holdt på med den siste tida i forbindelse med det totale kaoset som foregår i britisk politikk nå, og folk spør hvor lenge vil egentlig Liz Truss komme til å sitte som statsminister. Så de har satt opp en livestream av et salathode. Så dere kan sjekke ut Will Liz Truss outlast this lettuce på Daily Star sin nettside, og da det rett og slett et salathode som blir livestreamet, og som blir, i det siste har blitt servert ulike måltider.
Og sakte, men sikkert råtner.
Ja, riktig.
Bort. Ja, gøy.
Så vi får se hvem som vinner, Liz Truss eller salaten.
Jeg har en sterk tro på denne salaten, merker jeg.
Veldig bra.
Ja, men da snakkes vi igjen neste uke.
Det vi. Ha det bra.
Ha det.